In the crowded station, a tycoon was on his way to yet another billion-dollar merger, until a dirty little girl appeared, begging him not to board. He ignored the warning, unaware of what she truly knew. If you were touched by this beautiful story of resilience and love, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing. The noise of trains blended with the murmur of the crowd on that grey autumn morning in New York City. Grand Central Terminal pulsed with life, as businessmen in tailored suits rushed past tourists gawking at the celestial ceiling. Among the sea of faces, Richard Thorne stood out, impeccably dressed in an Italian suit, his leather briefcase gripped tightly in his manicured hand, his gaze cold and calculating. A Wall Street legend at 52, Richard had built Thorne Enterprises from nothing into a financial empire that dominated the skyline and the headlines. Today was particularly significant. In just 2 hours, he would sign the merger agreement with Stella Corp, a deal worth billions that would cement his legacy as one of the greatest business minds of his generation. His private train car waited on track 29, ready to take him to the company's retreat in the Catskills, where the executives would finalize the paperwork. Richard checked his Patek Philippe watch and frowned. The morning crowds were thicker than usual, slowing his purposeful stride. He despised delays almost as much as he despised incompetence. Time was money, and Richard Thorne had built his fortune by never wasting either. Mr. Thorne. His assistant Nathan West called from a few feet ahead. The board members are already on board. We should hurry if we want to stay on schedule. Nathan had been with Richard for 15 years, efficient, loyal, and discreet. The perfect right-hand man for someone with as many secrets as Richard. What the public saw was the brilliant investor, the ruthless negotiator, the philanthropist who wrote occasional large checks to children's hospitals. What remained hidden was the hollowness that had consumed him since Catherine's disappearance 7 years ago. Catherine. Even thinking her name sent a familiar ache through his chest. His wife had vanished during what was supposed to be a weekend retreat at their lake house in the Adirondacks. No body was ever found, no ransom demanded. She had simply disappeared, leaving behind only questions and the ghost of her smile that haunted his dreams. The police investigation had gone cold years ago. Richard had hired the best private investigators money could buy, but even they eventually suggested he accept the unacceptable, that Catherine was gone, likely claimed by the frigid waters of the lake. But Richard had never been able to believe it. Something inside him insisted she was still alive. "Sir?" Nathan's voice pulled him back to the present. "We really should board now." Richard nodded curtly and resumed walking toward the platform. That's when he heard it, a small voice cutting through the station's ambient noise with surprising clarity. "Stop! Please don't get on that train." Richard barely registered the words at first, assuming they were meant for someone else. But then a small figure darted through the crowd and planted herself directly in his path. A little girl no more than 7 years old, with tangled blonde hair and the most startling green eyes he had ever seen. Her clothes were worn and dirty, a tattered blue dress and scuffed shoes that had seen better days. She looked like she belonged on the streets, not in Grand Central Terminal. "Please, mister," she pleaded, those extraordinary eyes fixed on his face. "You can't get on that train. It's not safe." Security immediately moved toward her, but Richard held up his hand, something about the child's intensity giving him pause. "Young lady, I don't know who you are or what game you're playing, but I have important business to attend to." "It's not a game," she insisted, her voice rising in desperation. "I've seen what happens. I've drawn it all. Please, you have to believe me." Nathan stepped forward, his usually placid face twisted with annoyance. "Sir, let security handle this. We're already behind schedule." But the girl wasn't deterred. She reached into a shabby backpack and pulled out a worn sketchbook, flipping it open with trembling hands. "Look, I've seen it all in my dreams." Richard was about to wave the security guards forward when the girl spoke again, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Catherine sent me. She's waiting for you." The world seemed to stop. The noise of the station faded away. Richard stared at the child, his face drained of color. "What did you say?" he demanded, grabbing her thin shoulders. "What do you know about Catherine?" The girl didn't flinch under his grip. Instead, She held his gaze with a steadiness that seemed impossible for someone so young. "She wears a gold locket with a small diamond in the center. Inside is a picture of you on your wedding day. She never takes it off." Richard released her as if burned. The locket had been his gift to Catherine on their first anniversary. Its contents had been their secret. No one else could possibly know that detail. "Who are you?" he whispered. "My name is Lily," she answered simply. "And I need to show you something important." "Please, Mr. Thorne, don't get on that train yet." Nathan intervened, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is ridiculous. Sir, this child is clearly disturbed. Let me call child services." "No," Richard said, his eyes never leaving the girl's face. "I want to see what's in that sketchbook." Lily held it out to him. With hesitant hands, Richard took it and began to flip through the pages. His breath caught in his throat. The drawings were crude, childish in execution, but unmistakable in their content. The lake house. The dock where Catherine was last seen. The distinctive willow tree that had been their favorite reading spot. Details that no stranger should know. And then, more disturbing images, a train rushing through darkness, an abandoned station overgrown with weeds, a facility with barred windows that looked like some kind of institution, and faces his own, stern and shadowed, Nathan's oddly distorted, and most shocking of all, Catherine's, her eyes wide and pleading. "How did you—" Richard couldn't finish the question. The implications were too overwhelming. "I told you. I see things in my dreams," Lily explained, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Catherine shows me. She wants to come home." Nathan scoffed. "Sir, surely you don't believe this nonsense. This is clearly some kind of scam. The girl probably saw pictures of your wife in the newspapers." But Richard wasn't listening. He was staring at the final drawing in the book, a detailed sketch of the lake house's basement, with an X marked over a specific floorboard. A hiding place that only he and Catherine had known about. "The train is about to leave, sir," Nathan reminded him, checking his watch with pointed impatience. Richard looked from the sketchbook to Lily's determined face, then to the platform where his luxury train car waited. The rational part of his mind, the shrewd businessman who had built an empire on calculated decisions, told him to dismiss this bizarre interruption and continue with his plans. The merger was too important to jeopardize over the ramblings of a street child with a vivid imagination. Yet something deeper, perhaps the part of him that had never accepted Catherine's disappearance, whispered that this might be his only chance to find answers. "Nathan, call the board. Tell them I've been delayed by an urgent matter." "But sir, the merger—" "Can wait," Richard finished firmly. 24 hours won't change anything." Nathan's face registered shock, then concern. "This isn't like you, Richard. You never postpone business matters. Especially not for—" His eyes flicked dismissively toward Lily. "There's a first time for everything," Richard replied. He turned to the girl. "All right, Lily, you have my attention. But this better not be some elaborate hoax." Lily's face broke into a relieved smile. "It's not, I promise. But we should hurry. There's someone else you need to meet." "Who?" Richard asked, his curiosity now fully engaged. "An old friend of yours," Lily replied cryptically. "He's been waiting a long time to see you again." As Richard allowed himself to be led away by this strange child with impossible knowledge, he couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed world was about to change forever. Behind him, Nathan watched with narrowed eyes, pulling out his phone and stepping into a quiet corner of the station. The train to the Catskills departed without Richard Thorne, its whistle echoing through Grand Central Terminal like a warning. Richard followed Lily through the crowded terminal, his mind racing with questions. The little girl moved with surprising confidence, navigating the maze of corridors and platforms as if she'd spent her life in Grand Central. Richard noticed the curious glances from passers-by. A Wall Street titan trailing behind a disheveled child was hardly an everyday sight. "Where exactly are we going?" he asked, struggling to maintain his composure. The rational part of his brain screamed that this was madness, but the drawings in that sketchbook had shaken him to his core. "To the old waiting room in the West Wing," Lily replied, without turning around. "It's quiet there. Nobody goes there anymore." Richard vaguely recalled the space, an ornate room that had been closed to the public for renovations. "And who is this person we're meeting?" Lily slowed her pace, glancing up at him with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. Someone who knows what really happened to Catherine. Someone who's been hiding too. They reached a cordoned-off area with a no-entry renovation in progress sign. Lily ducked under the barrier with practiced ease. Richard hesitated, then followed, feeling increasingly like he'd stepped into some surreal dream. The grand waiting room beyond was shrouded in dust covers and scaffolding, sunlight streaming through the tall windows and dancing on the marble floor. Seated on a bench in the corner was a man Richard hadn't seen in nearly 8 years. James Cooper, once his closest friend and business partner, now a disgraced financier who disappeared from public view after a scandal involving misappropriated funds. The scandal that had cemented Richard's reputation while destroying James's. "Hello, Rich," James said quietly, standing as they approached. He looked older, his once robust frame thinner, his dark hair now streaked with grey. But his eyes held the same intelligence that had made him a formidable partner in their early days. Richard stopped abruptly, instinctively straightening his tie, a nervous habit from his younger days. "James, I thought you were in Europe." That's what everyone was supposed to think. James gestured to the bench beside him. "We have a lot to talk about and not much time." Richard remained standing, his businesslike facade reasserting itself. "I don't understand what's happening here. First, this girl appears with drawings of Catherine and our lake house. Then she leads me to you, of all people." James exchanged a meaningful look with Lily. "Show him the rest." Lily. The girl opened her backpack again and pulled out not just the sketchbook, but also a manila envelope. She handed the envelope to Richard with solemn ceremony. Inside were photographs and documents that made his blood run cold. Financial records from Thorn Enterprises showing systematic embezzlement dating back years. Forged signatures, his signatures, on transfers and authorizations he'd never seen. And most disturbingly, medical records for a patient named Jane Peterson at a private psychiatric facility in the Adirondacks, with a photograph clipped to the file that was unmistakably Catherine. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his voice barely controlled. "Where did you get these?" "I've been gathering evidence for years," James replied. "After what happened, I knew something wasn't right. The accusations against me, Catherine's disappearance, the sudden financial discrepancies. It was too coordinated, too perfect." "You're saying you were framed?" "That's convenient, isn't it?" Richard's tone was bitter, but uncertainty had crept into his eyes. "I'm saying we were both played," James countered, "by someone who wanted my reputation destroyed and you isolated. Someone who's been manipulating your company from within. Someone who arranged for Catherine to disappear when she started noticing the financial irregularities." Richard's gaze flicked to Lily, who was quietly flipping through her sketchbook. "And how does she fit into all this? Who is she?" James hesitated, exchanging another glance with the child. "That's complicated. Lily has Ton abilities. She sees things others can't, knows things she shouldn't be able to know. She found me 6 months ago with a drawing of my hideout and a message from Catherine. You expect me to believe a child with psychic powers tracked you down with doodles?" Richard's skepticism was reflexive, but even as he spoke, he remembered the impossible details in those drawings. "I know how it sounds," James admitted. "I didn't believe it either, until she started describing conversations Catherine and I had years ago, private conversations that nobody else witnessed." Richard turned to Lily. "If you can communicate with my wife somehow, why didn't you come to me sooner?" The girl looked up from her sketchbook. "I tried 3 times. Your security guards always took me away, and Catherine said the timing wasn't right yet. She said we needed proof first and we needed Mr. Cooper." Before Richard could respond, his phone buzzed. Nathan's name flashed on the screen. He silenced it without answering. "You shouldn't trust him," Lily said quietly, her eyes on the phone. "Nathan? He's been my right hand for 15 years. 16 years, James corrected. He joined Thorn Enterprises a year before I left. Recommended by that investment group from Chicago, remember?" Richard did remember. The Sentinel Group. They'd provided significant backing during a critical expansion phase. Nathan had arrived with impeccable credentials and quickly made himself indispensable. James continued, "Have you ever wondered why a man with his talents has stayed in an assistant position for so long? Never seeking advancement, never leaving for better opportunities. Just always there beside you with access to everything." Richard's phone buzzed again, a text message this time. Nathan, where are you? Board members concerned. Stellar Corp CEO threatening to walk. Call immediately. We should move, James said, standing up. We're too exposed here. Move where? I'm not going anywhere until I get answers that make sense, Richard insisted, though his customary certainty was crumbling. Lily tugged at his sleeve. To the train, Mr. Thorne, but not your train. A different one. She's right, James agreed. We need to get to the Adirondacks, but not on your private car. Nathan will be monitoring that. We'll take the regular service to Saratoga Springs and drive from there. Richard looked between them, the surreal quality of the situation intensifying. This morning he'd been poised to close the biggest deal of his career. Now he was in an abandoned waiting room with his disgraced former partner and a strange child, contemplating a journey based on sketches and wild accusations. Why should I trust either of you? He asked finally. James smiled sadly. Because we're not asking you to trust us, Rich. We're asking you to trust Catherine. If there's even a chance she's alive, don't you want to know? Richard's phone buzzed a third time. Another text. Nathan, security tracking your location in station. Stay where you are. Sending help. That decided it. Let's go. They slipped out through a service corridor, emerging on a different platform, just as a train to Albany was boarding. James produced tickets from his pocket. He'd come prepared. As they settled into their seats in the nearly empty first-class car, Richard studied Lily more carefully. There was something familiar about her features, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her chin. She caught him staring and offered a small smile that triggered a visceral sense of recognition he couldn't place. "How old are you, Lily?" he asked suddenly. 7.5, she answered, focusing on a new drawing she'd started. Richard did the quick math. 7.5 years. Catherine had disappeared 7 years ago. The implication sent his mind reeling. "Are you suggesting—" he began but couldn't finish the thought. James touched his arm. "One revelation at a time, Rich. First we find Catherine. Then all your questions will be answered." The train pulled out of the station, gathering speed as it headed north along the Hudson River. Richard watched the city recede, feeling as though he was leaving behind more than just Manhattan's skyline. His certainties, his carefully constructed reality, were already miles away. His phone buzzed again, Nathan, no doubt, but this time Richard turned it off completely. Whatever truth awaited him upstate, he was committed now. The only way was forward. Lily continued drawing beside him, her small hand moving with purpose across the page. Richard glanced down and saw she was sketching a lakeside facility, surrounded by tall trees, with a figure at a barred window. The face was Catherine's, exactly as he remembered her, down to the tiny scar above her right eyebrow from a childhood accident. No child could have known that detail from newspapers or photographs. "We'll be there tomorrow morning," James said quietly, noticing Richard's stunned expression. "Are you ready for what we might find?" Richard tore his gaze from the drawing. "If Catherine is alive, if someone has kept her from me all these years, I'll tear down heaven and earth to get her back." "That's what I'm counting on," James replied. "Because we're going up against someone with almost as much power and resources as you have. Someone who's had years to cover their tracks." "Nathan?" Richard asked, though he already suspected the answer. James nodded. "Nathan and whoever he's working for. The Sentinel Group isn't what you think it is. Rich, they've been using your company for something much bigger than profit." As the train rumbled northward, Richard gazed out at the passing landscape. Autumn colors blurring into a tapestry of reds and golds. For years he'd moved through life like an automaton, burying his grief in work and acquisition. Now, with each mile that carried him away from his familiar world, something long dormant stirred within him, a fierce determination that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the woman he'd never stopped loving. Lily had fallen asleep, her sketchbook still open to the drawing of Catherine. Richard gently closed it and placed it on the seat between them. Whatever strange gift this child possessed, it had given him something he'd lost years ago. Hope. The train slowed unexpectedly as it wound through the dense forests of the Adirondacks. Outside the window, morning mist clung to the trees, creating an ethereal landscape of shadows and silhouettes. Richard, who had barely slept, straightened in his seat. Across from him, James was already alert, a concerned frown creasing his forehead. "We shouldn't be stopping yet," he murmured, checking his watch. Saratoga is still 40 minutes away. The train's brakes squealed as they ground to a complete halt. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a temporary delay due to a signal malfunction. Please remain seated. We should be moving again shortly." Lily, who had been dozing against the window, suddenly jerked awake. Her eyes were wide with recognition as she pressed her face to the glass. "This is it," she whispered. "The station from my drawings." Richard followed her gaze. Through the mist, he could make out the dim outline of what appeared to be an abandoned train platform, a relic from another era, partially reclaimed by nature. Weathered wooden benches lined a crumbling concrete structure, and a faded sign hung askew, its letters no longer legible. "Westbrook Station," James said quietly. "It's been closed for decades. Used to be a stop for the logging companies back in the early 1900s. Richard frowned. "How do you know that?" "I've been researching everything connected to Catherine's disappearance for years," James replied. "This station is only 5 miles from your lake house." The realization struck Richard like a physical blow. All this time, his weekend retreats at the lake had placed him tantalizingly close to— what? Answers? Catherine herself. The possibility was almost too painful to contemplate. Lily was already gathering her things. "We need to get off here." "This isn't a scheduled stop," Richard objected. "They won't open the doors." James pulled out his phone, showing a message on the screen. "This isn't a coincidence. The signal malfunction is our window of opportunity. I have a contact in the railway company. We have exactly 7 minutes before they reset the system and continue the journey." Richard's years as a corporate strategist had taught him to recognize when a plan had been meticulously orchestrated. "How you arranged all this? The train, the stop. How long have you been planning this operation?" "Since Lily found me 6 months ago," James admitted. "But we can discuss the details later. Right now we need to move." They made their way to the nearest exit, where James exchanged a brief nod with a uniformed attendant who discreetly opened the door. The morning air was crisp and cold as they descended onto the overgrown platform, their breath forming clouds in the autumn chill. "This way," Lily said confidently, leading them toward a dilapidated station house covered in ivy and weather-stained to the color of ashes. As they approached the building, Richard felt an inexplicable sense of dread. Something about this forgotten place triggered a visceral reaction, not quite déjà vu, but a feeling that he had missed something important here before. The wooden door to the station house creaked open at James's push. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that penetrated the broken windows. The space was largely empty, except for an old ticket counter and some scattered debris, evidence of transient occupants over the years. "What are we looking for?" Richard asked, his voice echoing slightly in the abandoned room. Lily walked to the center of the floor and knelt down, brushing away decades of dust to reveal a trap door with an iron ring pull. "This," she said simply. James helped her lift the heavy door, revealing a set of steep stairs descending into darkness. He produced a flashlight from his bag, illuminating rough stone walls and what appeared to be an old storage cellar. "After you, Rich," he said, gesturing to the stairs. Richard hesitated, the businessman in him still resistant to this irrational adventure. But then he remembered Catherine's face in Lily's drawings, and his reservations dissolved. He took the flashlight and led the way down. The cellar was larger than it appeared from above, extending beyond the station house footprint. Metal filing cabinets lined one wall, their surfaces rusted but the locks still intact. A desk sat in the corner, covered with a sheet that James promptly removed, releasing a cloud of dust. "What is this place?" Richard asked, sweeping the flashlight beam across the room. "A record repository," James explained, examining the filing cabinets. When Westbrook Station was operational, it served as more than just a transit point. The logging companies used it as a secure location for their documents, financial records, employee files, land deeds. "What does this have to do with Catherine?" James didn't answer immediately, focusing instead on opening one of the cabinets with a key he extracted from his pocket. "The Sentinel Group didn't appear out of nowhere, Rich. Their roots go back over a century to the original timber barons who controlled this region. They've just evolved with the times from logging to finance." The cabinet opened with a metallic groan. Inside were folders, remarkably preserved in the dry cellar air. James pulled out several and laid them on the desk. Property deeds, he explained, opening the first folder. The Sentinel Group has been accumulating land throughout the Adirondacks for generations, always through shell companies and proxies. Your lake house sits on a parcel that connects several of their larger holdings. Richard examined the documents, recognizing patterns that his business acumen couldn't ignore. Complex ownership structures designed to obscure the true controllers. Familiar names appearing in unexpected places, including, to his shock, his own grandfather's signature on several transfers dating back to the 1960s. "My family was involved with Sentinel?" he asked, the ground seeming to shift beneath him once again. "Not knowingly," James assured him. "They were used, just as you've been. The Thorn name has legitimacy, respectability. Perfect cover for Sentinel's operations." While they spoke, Lily had wandered to a section of wall partially hidden behind another cabinet. She pressed her hands against the stones, her expression intent. "There's something here," she murmured. Richard and James joined her, examining the wall. It looked solid, but when Richard ran his fingers along the mortar lines, he felt a subtle difference in one section, newer material perhaps, or differently textured. "Stand back," James advised, producing a small pry bar from his bag. With surgical precision, he worked at the mortar until a stone loosened, then another. Behind them was a small cavity containing a metal box. The box was locked, but the mechanism yielded easily to James's tools. Inside was a collection of items that stole Richard's breath: Catherine's passport, her personal journal, a USB drive, and photographs, dozens of them, showing Catherine at various locations over the past 7 years. In the most recent ones, dated just 3 months earlier, she appeared thin and pale but unmistakably alive. "She's been alive all this time," Richard whispered, his fingers tracing her face in the photographs. "All this time while He couldn't finish the sentence. "While you were manipulated into believing she was gone forever," James completed for him. "These were insurance hidden by someone who wanted to preserve the truth in case things went wrong. But who would?" Richard's question was interrupted by a soft sound from the stairs. Lily, who had been examining the room's corners, suddenly froze. "Someone's coming," she whispered. James quickly repacked the box, securing it in his bag. "We need to move. There's another way out through the old maintenance tunnels." They followed him to the back of the cellar, where he shifted a heavy shelf to reveal a narrow passageway. The sound of footsteps on the stairs grew louder as they squeezed through the opening, James pulling the shelf back into place behind them. The tunnel was low-ceilinged and damp, forcing them to proceed in a stooped position by the narrow beam of the flashlight. After what seemed like an eternity of claustrophobic darkness, they emerged into a clearing in the forest, the morning sun now higher in the sky. "Who was that?" Richard asked as they caught their breath. "Nathan?" "Possibly," James replied, scanning the tree line warily. "Or one of his associates. Either way, we need to keep moving. The facility where Catherine is being held is about 3 miles from here." Richard looked down at Lily, who was remarkably composed for a child in such extraordinary circumstances. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. She offered a small smile. "I'm okay. I'm used to this." The simple statement carried disturbing implications. What kind of life had this child been living? And if his growing suspicions about her identity were correct? "James," Richard said quietly, pulling his former partner aside while Lily examined a nearby stream, "I need to know. Is Lily my daughter? Catherine's and mine?" James's expression softened. "I think you already know the answer to that, Rich. Look at her. Really look at her." Richard did. Beyond the tangled hair and dirt-smudged cheeks were features he recognized. Catherine's expressive eyes, his own determined chin, the distinctive thorn nose that had persisted through generations. How had he not seen it immediately? But how? Where has she been all these years? "That's a longer story, and one I think Catherine should tell you herself," James replied. "But what I do know is that Lily escaped from the same facility where Catherine is being held about 6 months ago. She's been trying to reach you ever since, while staying one step ahead of Nathan's people." The implications were staggering. Not only had his wife been alive all these years, but he had a daughter who had been hidden from him, who possessed extraordinary abilities, who had been forced to live as a fugitive while he remained oblivious in his tower of wealth and power. "I've failed them both," Richard said, the realization like ice in his veins. James gripped his shoulder firmly. No, you were deliberately kept in the dark. But now you have a chance to make it right. Lily returned to them, her small face solemn. We should go now. The bad people are getting closer. As they set off through the forest, Richard fought to process everything he had learned. His entire life had been built on carefully controlled information and strategic decision-making. Now he was navigating a wilderness of revelation and emotion. Guided by a child he had only just discovered was his own flesh and blood. One thought crystallized with perfect clarity: Nathan West would pay dearly for his betrayal. The man who had stood at Richard's side for 16 years, who had watched him grieve and never said a word, who had systematically undermined everything Richard had built, he would face a reckoning unlike anything in Thorn Enterprises' ruthless history. But first, they needed to find Catherine. The forest grew denser as they made their way northward. Following a path only Lily seemed to recognize, shafts of sunlight penetrated the canopy overhead, dappling the forest floor with patterns that shifted with each breath of wind. Under different circumstances, Richard might have appreciated the rugged beauty of the Adirondacks. Now his mind was consumed with a singular focus. Catherine. How much farther? He asked, checking his watch. They had been hiking for nearly 2 hours. Just over that ridge, Lily pointed to a gentle slope ahead. The building sits in a valley on the other side. It's surrounded by tall fences. James pulled a small pair of binoculars from his pack. We should get a look at the security situation before making any decisions. As they crested the ridge, Richard felt his breath catch. Below them, nestled among the trees, stood a sprawling facility that resembled a cross between a high-end retreat and a secure compound. The main building was constructed of natural stone and timber, with large windows that would have appeared welcoming if not for the subtle reinforcement of their frames. A perimeter fence, nearly invisible among the trees but undoubtedly robust, encircled the property. At regular intervals, cameras surveyed the grounds. Adirondack Wellness Center, James said, passing Richard the binoculars. Officially, it's an exclusive treatment facility for wealthy clients with stress and anxiety disorders. In reality, it's a prison for people the Sentinel Group wants to keep hidden but alive. Richard scanned the facility, his trained eye noting details others might miss. The security is impressive but not overwhelming. They're relying on isolation and discretion more than armed guards. They don't want to attract attention, James agreed. Many of their patients are high-profile individuals whose disappearances have been explained away as nervous breakdowns, retreats from public life, or unfortunate accidents. Like Catherine, Richard said grimly. Lily had been quiet, her gaze fixed on the building with unusual intensity. Now she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She's in the East Wing, 3rd floor, the room with the blue curtains. Richard adjusted the binoculars to focus on the location Lily had described. Sure enough, one set of windows on the 3rd floor had distinctive blue curtains, slightly different from the uniform beige ones in most other rooms. How do we get in? Richard asked, lowering the binoculars. The businessman in him was already formulating strategies, assessing risks and opportunities as he would for any high-stakes acquisition. James produced a tablet from his pack, bringing up what appeared to be building schematics. I have a contact, a former security guard who became uncomfortable with what he was witnessing. He provided these plans and some intelligence about their routines. There's a staff entrance on the north side with lighter security during shift changes. One happens at 4 p.m. daily. Richard checked his watch again. That gives us 3 hours to prepare. They retreated from the ridge to a small clearing where James had stashed supplies, changes of clothes, including what appeared to be medical scrubs and staff IDs, plus some basic equipment. You've been planning this for months, Richard observed, examining the forged credentials. I needed to be sure before involving you, James replied, and I needed Lily's confirmation that Catherine was still there. Patients get moved between facilities sometimes. Richard glanced at Lily, who was sitting on a fallen log, drawing in her sketchbook with intense concentration. The idea that this child, his child, had been carrying this burden alone was almost unbearable. May I see what you're drawing? He asked gently, approaching her. Lily hesitated, then turned the sketchbook toward him. The page showed a detailed layout of what appeared to be the facility's 3rd floor, with arrows indicating movement paths and notes about security cameras and guard positions. "How do you know all this?" Richard asked, astonished by the precision. "I was there for almost 4 years," Lily replied matter-of-factly. "They kept me in a different wing from Mum, but sometimes I could visit her if I behaved well. They were studying me because of my dreams." The casual way she described her captivity sent a chill through Richard. "Studying you?" Lily nodded. "Dr. Mercer said I have a rare neurological condition. That's why I can see things before they happen sometimes, or know things I shouldn't know." She glanced up at Richard. "He said I inherited it from you." Richard blinked in surprise. "From me? I don't have any special abilities." James, who had been organizing their gear, looked up. "Don't you, Rich? Your uncanny instinct for market movements, your ability to sense when a competitor is vulnerable, the way you always seem to know exactly when to buy or sell." "That's just business acumen and research," Richard protested. "Is it?" James challenged. "The Sentinel Group didn't choose your family by accident. They've been tracking certain genetic traits for generations, subtle cognitive abilities that most people dismiss as good luck or intuition." The implications were staggering. Richard had always prided himself on his analytical mind, his strategic foresight. The idea that something more extraordinary might be at work, something genetic, something that had been deliberately monitored and manipulated, was difficult to accept. "Are you saying the Sentinel Group has been—" "What? Breeding people with special abilities?" "Not breeding," James clarified. "Observing, studying, and occasionally containing those who manifest too strongly or become aware of what's happening." "Like Catherine," Richard said, the pieces beginning to fit together. "She discovered something." "She discovered everything," Lily interjected, looking up from her drawing. "She found files on Dr. Mercer's computer about the Sentinel Project, about you, about me before I was born. That's why they had to take her away." Richard's mind reeled. "But why keep her alive?" "If she knew so much, well, because of you," James explained. "Your business empire became too valuable to them. They needed you focused and productive, not destroyed by grief or distracted by an investigation into Catherine's possible fate. So they created the perfect scenario, a mysterious disappearance with just enough ambiguity to eventually force you to move on. And they kept her as insurance," Richard concluded, the cold calculation behind it all igniting his fury, "in case they ever needed leverage against me." "Yes," James confirmed, "but they didn't count on Lily's abilities manifesting so strongly or on her escaping and finding me." Richard turned to his daughter, the very thought still surreal, and knelt to her level. "Lily, I need to know. How did you escape?" The girl's expression darkened. "Dr. Mercer was showing me pictures, testing me. But I saw something he didn't want me to see. Pictures of Mom when they first brought her to the facility. She was pregnant then." She paused, meeting Richard's gaze directly. "With me?" The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. Catherine had been pregnant when she disappeared. He hadn't known. She must have been planning to tell him during that weekend at the lake house. "After that I started planning," Lily continued. "I pretended my abilities were getting weaker. They relaxed the security around me. One night during a power outage, I slipped out through a maintenance tunnel that I'd seen in my dreams." "And you found James?" Richard prompted, amazed at the resourcefulness of this child, his child. Lily nodded. "I saw him in my dreams too. Mom was thinking about him, about how he might help. So I went looking for him." James stepped forward. "She showed up at my door in Boston one night, soaking wet from the rain with a drawing of Catherine and a message only the 3 of us would understand." "What message?" Richard asked. "The willow still weeps," James and Lily said simultaneously. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. It was a phrase from a poem Catherine had written years ago, during a weekend at the lake house. The 3 of them had been sitting beneath the weeping willow, discussing literature and memory. Catherine had composed the verse on the spot, and they had made a pact that if any of them were ever in trouble, they would use that line as a code. "She remembered," Richard whispered. "She never forgot anything about you," Lily said simply. "She tells me stories every night in my dreams." Richard had to turn away for a moment, overcome. When he had composed himself, he faced James and Lily with newfound determination. "Tell me the plan again, every detail." For the next hour they reviewed the strategy James had developed. They would enter during the shift change, using the forged credentials. James would create a distraction in the West Wing, while Richard, posing as a visiting specialist, would make his way to Catherine's room. Lily would guide him through the corridors she knew so well, avoiding the most heavily monitored areas. Once we have Catherine, we'll exit through the service area and make our way to a vehicle I've arranged to have waiting in the staff parking lot, James explained. From there, we drive to a private airfield where a chartered plane will take us to a secure location. And then? Richard asked. James's expression was grim. Then we use everything we've gathered to expose the Sentinel Group and Nathan's role in all of this. The documentation we found at the station, combined with Catherine's testimony and the medical records showing her illegal detention, should be enough to launch a federal investigation. Richard nodded, but his thoughts had already moved beyond legal justice. Nathan isn't working alone. Someone higher up in my company must be involved. We have our suspicions, James admitted, but one step at a time. First, we get Catherine out safely. As the afternoon wore on, they changed into their disguises. Richard studied his reflection in a small mirror James provided, hardly recognizing himself in the doctor's attire with tinted glasses and a false beard. The transformation seemed fitting in many ways. He had become a different man in the space of 24 hours. Lily emerged from behind a tree, where she had changed into clean clothes, a simple outfit that made her look like the child of a staff member. With her hair brushed and face cleaned, the resemblance to Catherine was even more striking. Richard felt a surge of emotion so powerful, it nearly overwhelmed him. It's almost time, James announced, checking his watch. Are we ready? Richard looked at Lily, who nodded with a determination that belied her years. Then he thought of Catherine, so close after all this time, waiting behind those blue curtains without knowing that her rescue was imminent. Yes, he said firmly, let's bring her home. The Adirondack Wellness Center exuded an aura of peaceful exclusivity as Richard, James, and Lily approached the staff entrance. Nestled among towering pines, the facility's architecture blended harmoniously with its natural surroundings, stone and timber combining in a design that whispered luxury and discretion. Only the subtle security measures, cameras disguised as landscape lighting, the reinforced windows, the keypad entry systems, betrayed its true purpose. Remember, James murmured as they neared the entrance, confidence is key. Act like you belong. Richard nodded, adjusting his fake glasses. Throughout his business career, he had mastered the art of commanding a room, of projecting authority. Now he channeled that skill into his disguise as Dr. Robert Chen, a visiting neurological specialist. A small group of staff members was already gathered at the entrance, chatting casually as they waited for the shift change. James and Richard integrated themselves seamlessly, nodding polite greetings while keeping conversation minimal. Lily stayed close to Richard, playing the role of a staff member's child, accompanying her father for a few hours. The security guard at the entrance barely glanced at their IDs, his attention divided between the incoming shift and a football game playing on a small monitor at his station. They passed through the first barrier without incident. Inside, the facility maintained its upscale appearance, tasteful artwork on the walls, plush carpeting, ambient lighting that created an atmosphere of calm. If not for the subtle indications of security, the cameras, the reinforced doors to certain wings, the staff with earpieces, it might have been mistaken for an exclusive spa. This way, Lily whispered, guiding them toward a corridor that led deeper into the building. Staff elevators are less monitored. They navigated the hallways with purpose, Richard noting with grim satisfaction how his business attire and confident stride caused staff members to defer to him automatically, stepping aside with respectful nods. The trappings of authority worked the same way here as they did in his boardroom. At a junction where the corridor split, James gave Richard a meaningful look. I'll head to the West Wing now. Wait for my signal before proceeding to the third floor. Richard checked his watch, a simple timepiece that had replaced his distinctive Patek Philippe. 20 minutes. James nodded, then turned and walked briskly toward the West Wing, his posture relaxed but purposeful. Richard and Lily continued to the staff elevator, joining two nurses who were discussing patient medications. Richard adopted an air of distracted importance, scrolling through his phone as if reviewing important medical data, while Lily pressed the button for the third floor. "Are you Dr. Mercer's new consultant?" one of the nurses asked, noticing Richard's visitor badge. "Yes," Richard replied smoothly. "Just here for a few assessments on the special cases. My daughter's school had a professional development day, so she's shadowing me." He placed a protective hand on Lily's shoulder. The nurse smiled at Lily. "You must be very proud of your dad, Dr. Mercer. Only works with the best specialists." Lily offered a shy smile in return but said nothing. Richard could feel the tension in her small frame beneath his hand. The elevator doors opened on the third floor, and they stepped out into a quieter corridor. The atmosphere here was noticeably different, more clinical, more controlled. Doors had electronic locks, and the nurse's station was positioned to monitor all movement in the hallway. "We need to wait," Lily whispered, as Richard instinctively started toward the east wing. "Mr. Cooper hasn't made the distraction yet." They found a small waiting area with a view of the nurse's station and took seats. Richard pretending to review files on his tablet while Lily flipped through a magazine. The minutes crawled by, each second amplifying Richard's awareness of how close Catherine was, perhaps just a few hundred feet away, separated by walls and security systems, but achingly near after 7 years of emptiness. Suddenly, alarms blared from the west wing. Red lights flashed along the corridor, and the PA system announced a code yellow situation. The nurses at the station immediately responded, 2 of them hurrying toward the source of the alarm, while one remained behind, looking anxious and distracted. "Now," Lily said quietly, setting down her magazine. They moved quickly but calmly toward the east wing, Richard nodding to the remaining nurse as they passed. "Dr. Mercer asked me to check on patient 317 while this is being handled," he said authoritatively. The nurse hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course, doctor. Do you need assistance?" "No, thank you. Just a routine assessment. My assistant has the file." He gestured to Lily, who held a folder they had prepared. Once past the nurse's station, Lily led him down a corridor where the rooms had small windows in their doors, more like a hospital than the retreat-like atmosphere of the main building. Most curtains were drawn, but in some Richard caught glimpses of patients reading or staring vacantly out windows. The sight chilled him to the core. How many of these people were being held against their will, like Catherine? "This one," Lily whispered, stopping outside a door marked 317. Richard's heart pounded as he swiped the keycard James had provided. The lock clicked, and he pushed the door open slowly, uncertain what condition Catherine might be in after 7 years of captivity. The room was bathed in soft afternoon light, filtering through those distinctive blue curtains. It was comfortably furnished. A bed, a desk, bookshelves filled with volumes, even a small seating area, more like an upscale hotel suite than a prison cell. And there, standing by the window with her back to the door, was Catherine. She turned at the sound of the door opening, her expression guarded until she saw Lily. Then her face transformed with joy and fear. "Lily, what are you—" Her eyes moved to Richard, widening in shock as she recognized him despite the disguise. "Richard." For a moment, neither of them moved. Catherine looked thinner than he remembered, her once vibrant chestnut hair now streaked with premature silver. But her eyes, those remarkable eyes that Lily had inherited, were exactly as he remembered, bright with intelligence and emotion. "Catherine," he finally managed, his voice barely audible. She took a hesitant step toward him, as if afraid he might vanish. "Is it really you? Or another one of their tests?" "It's really him, Mom," Lily said, rushing to embrace her mother. "We came to take you home." Catherine clutched Lily tightly, her gaze never leaving Richard's face. "How did you find me?" "Lily found us," Richard explained, moving closer, still scarcely believing that his wife stood before him after so many years of grief and emptiness. "She escaped and brought James to me. We've been piecing it all together." At the mention of James, Catherine's expression shifted to concern. "James is here too? Where?" "Creating a diversion in the West Wing. But we don't have much time." Richard finally closed the distance between them, tentatively reaching for her hand. When she didn't pull away, he gently pulled her into an embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of her that had haunted his dreams for 7 years. "I thought I'd never see you again," Catherine whispered against his chest. "I never stopped looking for you." Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. Not really. Even when I thought you were gone, I couldn't let go. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway. Lily tensed, moving to the door to listen. We need to go now, she urged. So they're checking all the rooms. Catherine moved quickly, grabbing a small box from beneath her bed. My journals, she explained. Everything I've learned about Sentinel is in here. I've been documenting it all. Richard nodded, impressed by her foresight even in captivity. Is there anything else you need? Catherine shook her head. Just to get out of here. They keep me sedated most of the time, just enough to control me without completely dulling my mind. They want me functional but compliant. The thought of Catherine being drugged and controlled for years sent a wave of rage through Richard, but he channeled it into focus. We're leaving through the service area. James has a car waiting. Lily peered out into the hallway. It's clear for now, but we should hurry. They slipped out of the room, Catherine now wearing a sweater over her facility-issued clothes to make her less immediately recognizable. Richard led the way, projecting the confidence of a doctor going about his routine business, while Catherine kept her head slightly down, walking between him and Lily as if she were part of a normal consultation. They had almost reached the service elevator when a voice called out from behind them. Dr. Chen. I don't believe we've met. Richard turned slowly to face a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive suit, his smile pleasant but his eyes sharp and assessing. The man's gaze flicked from Richard to Catherine, recognition dawning in his expression. Dr. Mercer, Lily whispered, fear evident in her voice. Ah, Lily, Dr. Mercer said, his smile never wavering. I've missed our sessions. And Mrs. Thorne, you're looking well today. Better than usual, I'd say. Richard stepped forward, positioning himself between Mercer and his family. I don't believe we have anything to discuss, Doctor. On the contrary, Mercer replied smoothly. We have a great deal to discuss, Mr. Thorne. Yes, I recognize you despite that rather convincing disguise. You have your father's distinctive posture, something I noted in your file years ago. Catherine's hand found Richard's, squeezing it in warning. He's Sentinel's lead researcher, she murmured. He knows everything. Mercer's smile widened. Indeed I do, Mrs. Thorne, including the fact that your friend Mr. Cooper's little distraction in the West Wing has already been contained. Security is on its way to this floor as we speak. As if on cue, the elevator at the end of the corridor dinged, its doors beginning to open. Richard made a split-second decision. Run, he ordered, pushing Catherine and Lily toward the stairwell opposite the elevator. They burst through the door, just as security personnel emerged from the elevator. Richard could hear Mercer calling orders as they descended the stairs at a breakneck pace. Catherine moving with surprising agility, despite her years of confinement. There's an emergency exit on the ground floor, Lily called back to them. It leads directly to the parking area. They reached the ground floor, alarm sirens now blaring throughout the facility. The emergency exit was just ahead, its red exit sign a beacon of hope. But as they approached, 2 security guards appeared, blocking their path. Richard didn't hesitate. Drawing on long dormant skills from his college boxing days, he charged forward, catching the first guard with a precise strike that sent him stumbling backward. The second guard reached for his taser, but Catherine was quicker, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the wall and discharging it directly into the guard's face. The man recoiled, temporarily blinded, allowing them to push past. They burst through the emergency exit into the late afternoon sunlight, the parking lot stretching before them. Lily pointed to a dark SUV parked near the service entrance. That's our car. They sprinted toward it, hearing shouts behind them as more security personnel emerged from the building. The SUV's engine roared to life as they approached, James visible behind the wheel, his face tense with concentration. Get in, he shouted, throwing open the passenger doors. Catherine and Lily scrambled into the back seat while Richard took the front passenger side. Before he could even close the door properly, James accelerated, the tires squealing as they sped toward the exit. What happened to the distraction? Richard asked as they careened down the facility's winding access road. It worked, James replied grimly, until it didn't. They have more security than my contact indicated, and Mercer was supposed to be off-site today. He knows who we are, Catherine said from the back seat, her arm protectively around Lily. All of us. He's been studying the Thorne family for decades. James checked the rearview mirror. We've got company. 2 security vehicles. Richard looked back to see black SUVs similar to their own gaining on them. How far to the airfield? 20 minutes if we can lose them, James replied, executing a sharp turn onto the main road. But first we need to get through the checkpoint at the Forest Preserve boundary. The Adirondack Park had limited access points, many of which were staffed by rangers who monitored incoming and outgoing traffic. If Mercer had alerted them, they would be waiting. Take the logging road, Lily said suddenly, leaning forward between the front seats. It connects to Route 28 past the checkpoint. James glanced at her in surprise. Are you sure? I saw it in my dream last night, she confirmed. Turn left at the stone bridge half a mile ahead. James didn't question further, trusting the child's inexplicable knowledge. Sure enough, a small stone bridge appeared, and he made the turn onto a rough dirt road that wound deeper into the forest. The security vehicles initially missed the turn, buying them precious minutes. The logging road was barely maintained, jostling them mercilessly as James pushed the SUV to its limits. There's the connection to Route 28, Lily pointed, as a wider gravel road came into view ahead. They emerged onto the state highway, James immediately accelerating to blend with the sparse traffic. Richard checked behind them. No sign of pursuit yet, but it was only a matter of time. Catherine had been quietly examining the documents they had recovered from the station. Now she looked up, her expression troubled. These confirm what I've suspected for years. The Sentinel Group isn't just studying people with heightened intuitive abilities. They're trying to weaponize them, create predictive intelligence assets they can control. Assets like Lily, Richard said, the words bitter in his mouth. Catherine nodded. That's why they were so interested in her development. A child born to 2 people with the genetic markers they've been tracking for generations. She represented the culmination of their research. Richard turned to look at his wife and daughter, a fierce protectiveness surging through him. They will never touch either of you again. I promise you that. The road ahead curved around a lake, the late afternoon sun casting golden light across the water. In the distance, Richard could make out a small airstrip, a single-engine plane waiting on the tarmac. We made it, James said, relief evident in his voice. That's our ride. As they approached the airfield, Richard took Catherine's hand, squeezing it gently. When we get to safety, we'll have a lot to talk about. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with emotion. 7 years' worth. And a lifetime ahead, he added softly. The SUV pulled up beside the plane, whose pilot was already preparing for immediate takeoff. As they hurried across the tarmac, Richard glanced back at the road behind them, still clear, but he knew their pursuers wouldn't be far behind. Where are we going? Catherine asked as they boarded. Somewhere safe, James assured her. A place where we can regroup and plan our next move. As the plane began to taxi, Richard looked out the window at the Adirondack Mountains receding beneath them. Somewhere in those forests stood the facility where his wife had been held captive for 7 years, where his daughter had been studied like a lab specimen. The thought filled him with cold fury, but also determination. The Sentinel Group had taken everything from him once. They would not do so again. And Nathan West, the man who had posed as his loyal assistant while orchestrating this elaborate betrayal, would soon learn what it meant to make an enemy of Richard Thorne. Catherine leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, while Lily curled up in the seat across from them, already drifting to sleep. For the first time in 7 years, Richard felt complete. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family. 3 days after the rescue, Richard stood at the window of a secluded lake house in the Berkshires, watching the morning mist rise off the water. The safe house belonged to an old college friend of James, a retired judge with no connections to the financial world and a healthy skepticism of corporate power. It was the perfect place to regroup and plan their next move. Catherine was still sleeping, her body slowly adjusting to freedom and the absence of the drugs that had regulated her existence for 7 years. Lily sat cross-legged on the dock, sketching the landscape with the focused intensity that Richard was coming to recognize as her signature trait. The door opened behind him, and James entered with 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing one to Richard. "You've barely slept." "Too much to think about," Richard replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Too much to plan." The Past 3 days had been a whirlwind of emotion and strategic discussion. Catherine had filled in many of the gaps in their understanding of the Sentinel Group's operations and objectives. Her captivity had been carefully designed, comfortable enough to keep her compliant, restrictive enough to remind her of her powerlessness. Dr. Mercer had personally overseen her care, as he called it, using a combination of medication and psychological manipulation to keep her isolated and controlled. But Catherine Thorne had never been easily controlled. Throughout her captivity, she had maintained a careful facade of cooperation, while secretly documenting everything she observed and overheard. The journals she had managed to bring with her were filled with names, dates, and details that painted a disturbing picture of Sentinel's true purpose. "Have you decided what you're going to do about Nathan?" James asked, breaking into Richard's thoughts. Richard's jaw tightened at the mention of his former assistant. "Oh, I have plans for Nathan. Very specific plans." "He'll be expecting something," James cautioned. "By now, Mercer will have briefed him on everything that happened at the facility. They'll be watching your properties, your company, your known associates." "I'm counting on it," Richard replied with a cold smile. "Nathan thinks he knows me, my habits, my methods, my vulnerabilities. But he's only ever known the man I allowed him to see." James studied his friend's face. "You've changed, Rich." 7 years of manipulation will do that to a man, Richard said. "Finding out your life has been orchestrated, your grief exploited, your child hidden from you. Fate clarifies your priorities." Their conversation was interrupted by Catherine, who appeared in the doorway wrapped in a thick sweater despite the summer warmth. The years of captivity had left her perpetually cold. "Good morning," she said softly, coming to stand beside Richard. The simple domesticity of the moment, sharing coffee in the morning light, felt both achingly familiar and strangely new. "How did you sleep?" Richard asked, placing a gentle hand on the small of her back. "Better," Catherine replied. "The dreams are less intense." She looked out at Lily on the dock. "She's been out there since dawn. I worry about her." Richard followed her gaze. "She's extraordinary, Catherine. How she found James, how she guided us to you. I still can't fully comprehend it." Mercer called it intuitive convergence, as Catherine explained. The ability to connect seemingly unrelated patterns across time and space. He believed it was strongest in bloodlines that had shown consistent markers for generations, like yours. "And she inherited it from both of us," Richard mused. Catherine nodded. "That's why they were so interested in her development. They've been studying these abilities for decades, identifying families with the genetic markers, tracking inheritance patterns." "To what end?" James asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. "Prediction," Catherine said simply. "Economic, political, social. Imagine being able to anticipate market crashes, election outcomes, social movements, not through data analysis but through an intuitive understanding of how complex systems will align." Richard thought of his own business success, how often his hunches had proven correct against all conventional wisdom. He had always attributed it to thorough research and strategic thinking, but perhaps something more had been at work. That's why they targeted Thorne Enterprises, he realized, not just for its resources but because of my family history. "Your grandfather had it too," Catherine confirmed. "Sentinel has files on him dating back to the 1960s. They've been watching your family for generations, waiting for the right moment to fully integrate your operations into their network. And Nathan was their point man," Richard said, "the pieces fitting together with terrible clarity, placed in my organization to monitor me and gradually influence my decisions." "To make you dependent on him," Catherine agreed, "while isolating you from anyone who might notice the pattern like me." Richard's phone buzzed, a secure device James had provided, connected to systems that couldn't be easily tracked. The screen showed an alert from one of the monitoring programs they had established to track activity at Thorne Enterprises. "The board meeting is confirmed for tomorrow morning," Richard announced. Scanning the message, "Nathan has called an emergency session to address my concerning absence and the potential impact on the Stellar Corp merger." "He's making his move," James observed, "trying to consolidate control while you're out of the picture." Richard nodded, a grim satisfaction in his expression. "Exactly as we anticipated." They had spent hours developing a counter-strategy, using Lily's drawings and Catherine's intelligence to map out the power structures within Thorn Enterprises. Several board members appeared in Catherine's journals, identified as either direct Sentinel operatives or unwitting pawns. Others seemed to have been deliberately marginalized under Nathan's subtle guidance. "The documents from the station have been authenticated," James reported. "My contact at the Justice Department confirms they're sufficient to launch a preliminary investigation, especially combined with Catherine's testimony. But an investigation would take months, even years," Richard pointed out. "By then, Sentinel could have erased all evidence and repositioned their assets. We need to strike more directly." Catherine's expression grew troubled. "Richard, these people are dangerous. They kept me prisoner for 7 years. They experimented on our daughter. If you confront them openly—" "I'm not planning to confront them openly," Richard assured her, taking her hand. "I'm planning to do what I do best, execute a hostile takeover." The rest of the day was spent finalizing preparations. Richard reviewed the evidence they had compiled, financial records showing the systematic embezzlement, documentation of Sentinel's infiltration of his company, Catherine's journals detailing their research objectives. James coordinated with his contacts in law enforcement and media, establishing dead drops for the evidence in case their plan failed. That evening, as sunset painted the lake in amber and gold, Richard found Lily still on the dock, her sketchbook now filled with new drawings. "May I join you?" he asked, waiting for her nod before sitting beside her. Lily silently turned her sketchbook toward him. The pages showed scenes from what was clearly tomorrow's board meeting, the familiar conference room on the top floor of Thorn Tower, the faces of board members and executives, Nathan standing at the head of the table where Richard usually sat. But one drawing in particular caught his attention, a detailed sketch of Nathan's expression, twisted with shock and fear as he stared at something out of frame. "What is he looking at here?" Richard asked, pointing to the drawing. Lily's gaze was distant, focused on something only she could see. "You and Mom and the truth." She turned to a new page, revealing a drawing of Catherine standing in the doorway of the conference room, her presence creating obvious shock among the board members. "Will it work?" Richard asked quietly. "Our plan?" Lily considered the question with a seriousness that belied her years. "I've seen many possibilities," she admitted, "but this one feels brightest." She pointed to another drawing, this one showing Richard and Nathan in what appeared to be a private confrontation, separate from the board meeting. "This needs to happen first," she explained, "before the meeting. He needs a chance." Richard studied the drawing, understanding its significance. "A chance to make the right choice." Lily nodded solemnly. "Everyone should have that chance, Dad. Even him." The simple way she addressed him as Dad, something she had begun doing only yesterday, still sent a wave of emotion through him. This remarkable child who had endured so much, who had orchestrated a rescue against impossible odds, was asking him to offer mercy to the man who had helped destroy their family. "I'll try," he promised, though the cold fury that had sustained him these past days still burned beneath his calm exterior. Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed, Richard found Catherine in the small study, reviewing her journals one last time. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "You don't have to come tomorrow. James and I can handle it." Catherine looked up, her expression resolute. "I've been silent for 7 years, Richard. Hidden away, erased from my own life. I need to look them in the eyes when their world comes apart." Richard crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "When this is over, when Sentinel is exposed and Nathan is dealt with, what do you want our life to be?" Catherine's eyes softened. "Simple, quiet, safe for Lily." She squeezed his hands. "I don't care about the company or the wealth or any of it. I just want our family whole. Even if that means leaving everything behind, starting fresh somewhere new, especially then," she said firmly. "The Richard Thorn I knew could build an empire from scratch once. I imagine he could do it again if he wanted to." Richard smiled, the first genuine smile in days. Or perhaps he could find something more meaningful to build. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Richard, dressed with methodical precision in one of the bespoke suits James had acquired for him, armor for the battle ahead. Catherine chose a simple but elegant outfit that highlighted her, natural dignity despite the weight she had lost during captivity. Before leaving, they spoke with Lily. who would remain at the safe house with James's most trusted associate, a former Special Forces operator who had once saved James's life and now worked as his security consultant. "Remember what I showed you," Lily said, hugging Richard tightly. "The right words at the right moment." "I remember," Richard assured her, kissing the top of her head. The drive to Manhattan took just under 2 hours. They remained silent for much of the journey, each lost in their own thoughts. As the skyline came into view, Catherine reached for Richard's hand. "No matter what happens today," she said quietly, "we've already won the most important battle. We found each other again. We have our daughter back." Richard brought her hand to his lips. "And we're going to make sure they never threaten that again." Thorn Tower dominated the midtown skyline, its sleek glass exterior reflecting the morning sun. Richard had designed it himself, a monument to his success and vision. Now it felt like the elaborate stage set for a play in which he had been merely an actor, reciting lines written by unseen hands. They parked in a public garage 2 blocks away, avoiding the building's security cameras. James had provided access credentials that would get them to the executive floor without being logged in the main security system. According to their intelligence, Nathan would arrive an hour before the board meeting to prepare his presentation. That would give Richard the window Lily had indicated, the private confrontation that needed to happen first. "Are you ready?" Richard asked as they approached the service entrance. Catherine's answer was to straighten her shoulders and lift her chin, a gesture so familiar it made his heart ache. "I've been ready for 7 years. The service elevator carried them to the 58th floor. The executive suite was quiet, most staff not yet arrived for the day. Richard led the way to his private office, where Nathan would undoubtedly be preparing. Sure enough, through the frosted glass door, they could see a figure moving about the spacious corner office. Richard paused, his hand on the door handle, and took a steadying breath. "Wait here," he told Catherine. "I need to do this part alone." She nodded, stepping back into an alcove where she wouldn't be immediately visible. Richard opened the door silently. Nathan stood at the window, his back to the door, phone pressed to his ear. "Everything is proceeding as planned," he was saying. "The board is prepared to vote for temporary leadership transition, citing abandonment of duties. Yes, the merger documents are ready for signing. No, there's been no contact from Thorn or any indication of his whereabouts." Richard closed the door with a deliberate click. Nathan spun around, his face draining of color as he saw who stood before him. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, his voice suddenly strangled. He ended the call, visibly struggling to regain his composure. "Richard, thank God you're safe. We've been worried sick. Where have you been?" "That's an interesting question, Nathan," Richard replied, his voice dangerously calm as he moved further into the office. "Especially coming from the man who spent 16 years lying to my face." Nathan's expression flickered between surprise and calculation. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Look, you disappeared without explanation, missed the merger meeting. The board is concerned about your stability. But now that you're here, we can explain." "Stop," Richard commanded, the word cutting through Nathan's practiced deception. "It's over. I know everything. About Sentinel, about Catherine, about my daughter." The mention of Lily caused Nathan to flinch visibly. "Richard, I think you need help. These conspiracy theories. Did you know from the beginning?" Richard interrupted, circling the desk that had once been his. "When the Sentinel Group placed you in my company, did you already know what your role would be? Or did that come later?" Nathan's facade finally cracked. His shoulders sagged slightly and a new expression crossed his face, something between resignation and defiance. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said quietly. "Sentinel isn't just an organization, Richard. It's the future. What we're developing, the ability to anticipate global patterns to guide human progress. It's bigger than any individual. Even you. And that justifies kidnapping my wife, experimenting on my child, manipulating my company?" Richard's voice remained controlled, but ice had crept into his tone. "Catherine was a complication," Nathan replied, his true nature now fully revealed. "She discovered financial irregularities, started asking questions. We needed her contained, not eliminated. And Lily, she's extraordinary. A once-in-a-generation convergence of genetic markers. The work Dr. Mercer has done with her will benefit humanity in ways you can't imagine. Richard studied the man who had been his shadow for 16 years, seeing him clearly for the first time. You actually believe that, don't you? That the ends justify any means. Look at what we've accomplished, Nathan urged, gesturing to the skyline visible through the window. Thorn Enterprises has shaped the future of global finance. Your instincts, guided by our intelligence, have created unprecedented wealth and innovation. So imagine what we could do with Lily's abilities fully developed and directed. That's not going to happen, Richard said flatly. Sentinel's operation is finished. I have everything. The financial records, the documentation of Catherine's illegal detention, evidence of your systematic embezzlement and fraud. It's all being delivered to federal authorities as we speak. Nathan's expression hardened. You're bluffing. You've been gone for days. You have nothing. He has me, Catherine said, stepping into the office. Nathan froze, his face contorting with shock, exactly as Lily had drawn it. That's impossible. You're supposed to be locked away, drugged into compliance. Catherine moved to stand beside Richard, her gaze steady and unflinching. Your security isn't as impenetrable as you thought. Neither are your secrets. For a moment, Nathan seemed genuinely lost, his carefully constructed world visibly crumbling around him. Then his expression hardened, a cold calculation replacing the shock. It doesn't matter, he said finally. Sentinel is bigger than me, bigger than this company, bigger than all of us. You can expose me, even destroy this particular operation, but you can't stop what's coming. Richard glanced at his watch. The board will be arriving soon. You have a choice to make, Nathan. You can cooperate. Tell us everything you know about Sentinel's structure, their key players, their other operations, and perhaps salvage something from this disaster. Or you can go down with the ship. And why would I cooperate? Nathan scoffed. Richard smiled thinly. Because Lily suggested I give you the chance. And despite everything you've done to my family, I respect my daughter's wisdom. The mention of Lily seemed to unsettle Nathan more than anything else had. She's with you. She's safe. She's free, Catherine corrected. Free from Mercer. Free from your experiments. Free to be a child again. Nathan moved to the desk, sinking into Richard's chair as the full implications settled over him. You don't understand what you've done. Mercer won't stop looking for her. Sentinel won't simply disappear because you've exposed one operation. Then help us end it, Richard urged, leaning forward. Give us what we need to dismantle their entire network. Outside the office, they could hear the first board members arriving for the meeting. Nathan glanced toward the door, then back at Richard and Catherine. In his eyes, something shifted. A calculation, a decision. There's a safe, he said finally. Behind the Rothko in your private conference room. The combination is Catherine's birthday. The real one, not the date in her public records. Inside, you'll find a drive with everything. The complete organizational structure, financial channels, key personnel. Richard exchanged a glance with Catherine. Why would you keep such dangerous information? A bitter smile crossed Nathan's face. Insurance. Sentinel doesn't tolerate failure. I always knew I might need leverage one day. He straightened in the chair. What happens now? Now, Richard said, checking his watch again. We have a board meeting to attend. Spring had come early to the coast of Maine, painting the rugged landscape in tender greens and the delicate pinks of wild roses. From the wide porch of the renovated lighthouse keeper's cottage, Richard watched Lily darting along the shoreline, collecting shells and sea glass with the focused intensity she brought to everything. Catherine sat beside him, a thick sweater wrapped around her shoulders despite the mild temperature, her fingers moving swiftly over her laptop keyboard. 10 months had passed since the day they had walked into the Thorn Enterprises boardroom and changed everything. Richard still remembered the stunned silence that had fallen over the assembled executives when Catherine appeared beside him, a ghost made flesh, the missing wife whose disappearance had been the subject of whispered speculation for years. Nathan had remained seated at the far end of the table, his usual position at Richard's right conspicuously abandoned, his expression unreadable as Richard methodically laid out the evidence of Sentinel's infiltration. 3 board members had tried to leave. When Richard revealed their connections to the organization, they had found federal agents waiting in the hallway. The aftermath had been both more chaotic and more controlled than Richard had anticipated. James's careful preparation had ensured that the evidence reached multiple agencies simultaneously, preventing any single compromised department from burying the investigation. The financial markets had trembled briefly at the news of corruption within one of the world's largest investment firms, but Richard's public commitment to transparency and reform had steadied the waters. Dr. Mercer had disappeared the day after the facility was raided, but international warrants ensured he would spend his life looking over his shoulder. The Adirondack Wellness Center had been shut down. Its patients, many of whom proved to be unwilling captives like Catherine, released to appropriate care facilities or reunited with shocked families who had long believed them lost. Nathan had cooperated, perhaps more thoroughly than anyone had expected. The drive from the hidden safe had indeed contained a comprehensive map of Sentinel's operations, enough to keep federal investigators busy for years. In exchange for his testimony, he had been placed in a witness protection program, his current location known only to a handful of officials with the highest security clearances. "Another article about the Thorne Foundation?" Richard asked, nodding toward Catherine's laptop. She smiled, turning the screen so he could see. The education initiative for gifted children with non-standard cognitive patterns. The pilot program has identified 17 children in the Northeast who show markers similar to Lily's. "Without the invasive testing or manipulation," Richard added, a note of satisfaction in his voice. The Thorne Foundation had been Catherine's idea, a way to redirect the vast resources of their family wealth toward healing the damage Sentinel had done and preventing similar exploitation in the future. While Richard had stepped down as CEO of Thorne Enterprises, transferring leadership to a carefully vetted team of executives, he had thrown himself into the Foundation's work with unexpected passion. "Lily's new teacher sent over her assessment," Catherine said, switching to another document. "She says Lily's mathematical intuition is extraordinary, but she needs more structured support for her written expression." "Balance," Richard mused. "That's what we're all learning, isn't it?" Their daughter's education had been a complex challenge. After years of isolation and irregular instruction at the facility, Lily struggled with the structured environment of traditional schooling. Yet her intellectual capabilities far exceeded standard grade-level expectations. They had finally settled on a hybrid approach, part homeschooling, part attendance at a progressive private academy that emphasized personalized learning. "James called," Catherine mentioned, closing her laptop. "The last of the civil suits against Sentinel's shell companies has been settled. The Victims' Compensation Fund is fully funded." Richard nodded, watching as Lily waved excitedly at something she had discovered in a tidal pool. "And the research?" "Progressing," Catherine replied. "The team at MIT believes they've identified the neurological markers associated with intuitive convergence. Without Mercer's unethical approaches, of course, but with a better understanding of the underlying mechanisms. Understanding the genetic and neurological basis of the abilities Sentinel had sought to exploit had become one of the Foundation's key research initiatives, not to control or weaponize these talents, but to help those who possessed them navigate their unique cognitive landscapes without being manipulated or isolated. "She's happier," Richard observed, nodding toward Lily, "more present." The changes in their daughter over the past 10 months had been remarkable. The hyper-vigilant, solemn child who had appeared at Grand Central Terminal had gradually given way to a more typical 7-year-old, still extraordinarily perceptive, still capable of insights that sometimes took Richard's breath away, but increasingly capable of simply being a child, of experiencing joy in the moment without the burden of adult concerns. "We all are," Catherine replied, reaching for his hand. Their own healing had been a more complex journey. Catherine's years of captivity had left deep scars, not just the physical effects of long-term medication and confinement, but the psychological impact of having her autonomy systematically stripped away. There were still nights when Richard would wake to find her standing by the window, scanning the darkness for threats only she could perceive. For Richard, the process of rebuilding trust, in others, in institutions, in his own judgment, remained an ongoing challenge. The discovery that so much of his life had been subtly manipulated, that his closest confidant had been orchestrating his isolation and exploitation for years, had shaken him to his core. Yet here, in this remote coastal sanctuary, they had begun to forge something new, Not a return to what had been, that was impossible, but the creation of a family identity, grounded in their shared experience and common purpose. Dad! "Mom, come see!" Lily called from the shoreline, waving them toward her discovery with infectious excitement. They made their way down the weathered wooden steps to the narrow beach. Lily stood beside a tidal pool where an intricate ecosystem of miniature marine life flourished. Tiny crabs scuttling among colorful anemones, translucent shrimp darting through swaying seaweed. "It's a whole world," Lily explained, her eyes wide with wonder. "And they don't even know we're watching them." The observation carried echoes of their own recent history that weren't lost on Richard. But Lily's expression held none of the darkness such a comparison might suggest, only genuine fascination with the natural world unfolding before her. "I'm going to draw it," she decided, already reaching for the sketchbook she carried everywhere. As she settled onto a sun-warmed rock and began to capture the scene with her characteristic precision, Catherine leaned against Richard's shoulder. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it here," she confessed quietly. "There were days in that place when I was convinced I'd never see the sky again, let alone watch our daughter grow up." Richard wrapped his arm around her waist, drawing her closer. "I should have found you sooner. I should have seen through Nathan's deception, questioned the circumstances of your disappearance more thoroughly." "Stop," Catherine interrupted gently. "We've been through this. Sentinel had decades of experience in manipulating perception and controlling narratives. They isolated you deliberately, removed anyone who might have helped you see the truth. It was a conversation they had revisited many times during their healing process. The temptation to dwell on what might have been, the years they had lost, the milestones they had missed in Lily's early life, remained powerful. Their therapist had encouraged them to acknowledge these feelings without allowing them to overshadow the present. Besides, Catherine added with a small smile, our daughter rescued us both. That's something worth celebrating, not lamenting. Richard watched as Lily's pencil moved swiftly across the page, capturing not just the visual details of the tidal pool, but somehow its essence, the delicate balance of its ecosystem, the interconnectedness of its inhabitants. Her gift, once exploited by Sentinel for prediction and control, now expressed itself through art and observation, through connection rather than manipulation. The Institute opens next month, he said, shifting to more practical matters. The board wants us both there for the ribbon cutting. The Paistosiap Thorne Institute for Cognitive Research represented the culmination of their work over the past 10 months, a facility dedicated to ethical exploration of the abilities Sentinel had sought to weaponize, combined with a support center for individuals and families navigating these unique neurological patterns. I've been thinking about Mercer's research, Catherine said thoughtfully. Not his methods, those were unconscionable, but his fundamental insight that these cognitive patterns might represent an evolutionary adaptation, a way of processing complexity that conventional analysis can't match. You want to continue the research? Richard asked, surprised. I want to reclaim it, Catherine clarified, transform it from something exploitative into something empowering. If there are others like Lily, and we know they deserve to understand their own minds without fear of being controlled or manipulated. This was the Catherine that Richard had fallen in love with decades ago. Brilliant, compassionate, capable of seeing beyond immediate circumstances to broader possibilities. Her years of captivity had dimmed, but never extinguished that essential quality. The Institute would be the perfect platform, he agreed. Complete transparency, ethical oversight, participant autonomy at every stage. And no corporate or government applications, Catherine added firmly. Pure research for the benefit of the individuals involved. A gust of wind swept up from the water, carrying the fresh scent of salt and seaweed. Lily looked up from her drawing, her expression suddenly distant in the way that still occasionally caught them by surprise, a momentary connection to something beyond immediate perception. Someone's coming, she said calmly, returning to her sketch. But it's okay. It's just Mr. Cooper. Sure enough, the sound of tires on gravel drifted down from the cottage's small parking area. Moments later, James appeared at the top of the beach steps, a cardboard file box in his arms. Special delivery, he called, making his way carefully down to the beach. The last of the Sentinel files from the Justice Department. They've completed the digital archiving and released the originals to the Foundation's research team. Over the past months, James had served as their primary liaison to the ongoing investigations. His reputation gradually rehabilitated as his role in exposing Sentinel's operations became public knowledge. His financial expertise had proven invaluable in tracing Sentinel's complex money trails and in establishing the structures needed to compensate its victims. "Anything significant?" Richard asked as James set the box on a flat rock. "Mostly historical records," James replied. "Documentation of their earliest research in the 1950s, genealogical tracking of families with the genetic markers they were interested in." He nodded toward Lily. "Including complete records on both your families going back 4 generations." Catherine's expression tightened. "They were monitoring our families before we were even born." "Playing the long game," James agreed. "The files show they were deliberately encouraging certain family connections, manipulating circumstances to increase the likelihood of partnerships between individuals with complementary genetic profiles. Like arranging for Richard and me to meet at that conference in Boston," Catherine said softly. It had been one of the most difficult revelations that their initial meeting, which both had treasured as a moment of serendipity, might have been orchestrated as part of Sentinel's multi-generational breeding program. They had struggled to reconcile this knowledge with the genuine love that had grown from that first encounter. "Their plans, their manipulations, those aren't what define us," Richard said firmly, voicing the conclusion they had reached after many difficult conversations. "What matters is what we choose to do now, with full awareness and agency." James nodded toward Lily, who was adding final details to her drawing, seemingly oblivious to the adult conversation. "How is she handling everything?" "Better than we are most days," Catherine admitted with a small smile. "The therapy is helping, and being here, away from constant stimulation and pressure, has made a tremendous difference." "She still has the dreams," Richard added, "but they're less frequent, less intense, and she's learning to integrate that aspect of her cognition without being defined by it." Lily closed her sketchbook and joined them, instinctively reaching for Catherine's hand. "Is it lunchtime?" "I'm starving." The simple childlike request, so normal, so beautifully ordinary, brought smiles to all three adults. This too was part of their healing process, reclaiming the mundane rhythms of family life that had been denied them for so long. They made their way back to the cottage, where Catherine prepared sandwiches, while Richard and James reviewed the contents of the file box. Lily set the table without being asked, arranging everything with the precise attention to detail that characterized all her activities. As they settled around the table, Richard was struck by a profound sense of rightness that transcended the trauma of the past years. Here, in this simple moment of shared meal and conversation, was everything that Sentinel had attempted to destroy: family, connection, autonomy, trust. "I've been thinking," Catherine said, passing the plate of cookies Lily had helped bake that morning, "about what comes next, for all of us." Richard recognized the thoughtful tone that meant she had been formulating a new idea. "Tell us." "The Institute is important," she began. "The research, the support programs, the education initiatives, they're all vital. But I keep coming back to the children who are still out there, unidentified and vulnerable." "Children like Lily was," James supplied, immediately understanding. Catherine nodded. "Children with unusual cognitive patterns, who might be noticed by organizations with less ethical intentions than ours. Children whose families might not understand what they're experiencing. You want to find them before someone else does," Richard said, immediately grasping the implications. "I want to create a sanctuary," Catherine corrected. "Not a facility, not an institution, but a community. A place where these children and their families can learn and grow together, protected but not isolated, supported but not controlled." As she outlined her vision, a learning community centered around the needs of children with extraordinary cognitive abilities, combining education, research, support services, and security, Richard felt a familiar surge of admiration for his wife's capacity to transform trauma into purpose. "The Foundation could fund it," he said, already considering the logistics. "We have the resources, the expertise, the network. I know the perfect location," James added. "Our former school campus in Vermont, secluded but accessible, with enough land for future expansion." Lily, who had been listening intently, set down her sandwich. "I could help," she said quietly. "I know what it's like. I could show them they're not alone." The simple offer, made with such straightforward compassion, brought a lump to Richard's throat. After everything she had endured, Lily's instinct was not to retreat from her experiences, but to use them to help others, a resilience that humbled him daily. "That would be wonderful." "Sweetheart," Catherine said, squeezing her daughter's hand, "but only if and when you're ready. There's no rush." The conversation continued throughout the afternoon, the initial concept expanding and taking shape as each of them contributed ideas and considerations. By evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson, the outlines of their next chapter had begun to emerge with surprising clarity. Lily had fallen asleep on the porch swing, her sketchbook open beside her to a drawing of what appeared to be a campus of buildings nestled among trees, her intuitive visualization of the sanctuary Catherine had described. "She's already seeing it," Richard observed softly, covering their daughter with a light blanket. Catherine nodded, a blend of wonder and acceptance in her expression. "That's her gift. She sees possibilities before they materialize." "Like her mother," Richard said, settling beside Catherine on the porch steps. The comment drew a smile from Catherine. "And her father. We make a formidable team, the three of us." As darkness settled over the coast, stars emerging in the clear spring sky, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the chaos of Grand Central Terminal to the quiet of this coastal haven, from manipulation and separation to reunification and purpose, it was a path none of them would have chosen, yet one that had forged them into something stronger than they had been before. The lighthouse beacon began its rhythmic sweep, a steady pulse of light guiding vessels safely to shore. Richard found it an apt metaphor for what they were building now, not an empire of finance and influence, as he had once pursued, but a beacon of understanding and support for those navigating treacherous waters. "Do you ever miss it?" Catherine asked suddenly. "The company, the power, the life we had before?" Richard considered the question carefully. "I miss the certainty," he admitted, "the clarity of purpose I thought I had. But that clarity was an illusion, carefully constructed by others to serve their purposes, not mine." He gestured toward the sleeping form of their daughter, toward the cottage that had become their sanctuary, toward Catherine herself, the true north of his recalibrated compass. "This is real," he said simply. "Everything that matters is right here." Catherine leaned against him, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. "Then we've already won." As the night deepened around them, Richard Thorne, once defined by his wealth and power, now remade by love and purpose, finally understood what true success meant. Not the acquisition of assets or influence, but the creation of something authentic and enduring. Not an empire built on manipulation and control, but a family forged in adversity and united in vision. The path ahead would not be without challenges. Sentinel's influence had been diminished but not eliminated. Dr. Mercer remained at large. The children they hoped to help would bring their own complex needs and histories. But for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever, Richard faced the future with genuine clarity. His priorities aligned with his deepest values. The little girl who had stopped him from boarding a train had not only saved him from physical danger, but had guided him toward a more meaningful existence than he could have imagined. The wife he had thought lost forever had returned not only to his life but to his purpose, transforming their shared trauma into a mission that transcended personal healing. Together, they had discovered that true power lay not in prediction or control, but in connection and care. Not in manipulating the future, but in creating it, moment by moment, choice by choice, with those they loved. And that, Richard reflected as he gazed at the stars above the peaceful Maine coast, was a future worth building,